Today is Transfiguration Sunday. That means it's the last Sunday of the season of Epiphany, the weeks between the end of the 12 days of Christmas and the beginning of Lent. During the Epiphany season, it is traditional to read stories from the Gospels about Jesus manifesting himself to the world. The word epiphany means manifestation. The Transfiguration is a particularly dramatic manifestation of Jesus' identity and divine mission. As Jesus is preparing to lead his disciples to Jerusalem for what will be the end of his life, he withdraws to a mountaintop along with three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. There the three disciples have a vision in which Jesus is transfigured, meaning that his appearance is transformed. He radiates divine light. Along with Jesus, the disciples see two other figures, Moses and Elijah, the two most revered Israelite prophets. The appearance of these figures is a sign that, like them, Jesus has been given an important mission by God. In Luke's version of this story, Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus about what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem, his death, resurrection, and departure from this world. The experience is awe-inspiring. Peter tells Jesus, "Rabbi," meaning teacher, "it is good for us to be here." Although Mark tells us that when Peter says this, he's really just babbling out of fear. Then a cloud comes over them, and out of the cloud they hear the voice of God saying, "This is my Son, the Beloved, listen to him." At which point the vision ends, and the three disciples find themselves alone with Jesus, who has his normal appearance again. What meaning does this story have for us? I want to answer that question by exploring an event from Community of Christ's early history in the 1800s, an event that links the story of the Transfiguration to our faith community's understanding of our mission. 5.5 hours drive from here, outside Cleveland, is a little town called Kirtland. In the 1830s, Kirtland was settled by a religious group who called themselves the Saints. Community of Christ arose from this religious group. In Kirtland, the Saints built a temple, which Community of Christ owns and operates today as a historic site. In the 1830s, the Saints used the Kirtland Temple as a place of worship, as office space for church leaders, and as a place where priesthood holders were trained for ministry. The Saints called this building a temple because they had faith that God would dwell there and would manifest himself to them through revelation and spiritual outpourings. Priesthood holders gathered in the temple for an event they called the endowment, a kind of spiritual retreat during which they testified, sang, and prayed together, shared a meal of bread and wine, washed one another's feet as Jesus did for his disciples, and received blessings by the laying on of hands to prepare them spiritually to go out into the world on missions. Some of the saints said that they experienced visions in the temple. Two of the church's leading elders, Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery, reported that on Easter Sunday, 1836, while they were praying in the Kirtland Temple, they had a vision in which they saw the resurrected Jesus standing over the temple's pulpits. Joseph and Oliver reported that they also saw in their vision the prophet Moses and the prophet Elijah, and that all three figures spoke to them. This vision of Joseph and Oliver's reenacts Peter, James, and John's vision of the Transfiguration. And because this vision occurred in the Kirtland Temple, a site sacred to Community of Christ, the vision links our particular faith community in a particularly vivid way to the story of the Transfiguration. I don't know how well known this story from Community of Christ's early history is among most Community of Christ members today, but it's a story that I grew up with. And I'd like to propose on this Transfiguration Sunday that this vision of Joseph and Oliver's in the Kirtland Temple can serve Community of Christ today as a vivid reminder of our faith community's mission. Today in Community of Christ, we describe our mission in terms of 5 mission initiatives: invite people to Christ, abolish poverty and end suffering, pursue peace on earth, develop disciples to serve, and experience congregations in mission. The first 3, invite people to Christ, abolish poverty and end suffering, pursue peace on earth, are the core of the church's mission. The other two, develop disciples to serve and experience congregations in mission, refer to initiatives that prepare individuals and congregations to carry out the first three mission initiatives. How does the Transfiguration vision in the Kirtland Temple relate to these mission initiatives? Well, let's look more closely at what Joseph and Oliver said that they were told during their vision. According to Joseph and Oliver, in their vision, the risen Jesus said to them, "I am he who lives. I am he who was slain." Jesus told them that he accepted the house, the temple, that the saints had built for him, and he promised to manifest himself in mercy to his followers in the temple. He promised that the ministries undertaken by the saints would be a force for good in the world. The hearts of thousands and tens of thousands will greatly rejoice in consequence of the endowment with which my servants have been endowed in this house, meaning the spiritual outpourings that priesthood holders had received in the temple to prepare them for ministry. This, Jesus promised, is the beginning of the blessing, which will be poured out on the heads of my people. Then Joseph and Oliver said they had a vision of the prophet Moses, who committed to them the keys of the gathering of Israel from the four parts of the earth. What does that mean? The early saints believed that God's plans for the future included making it possible for Jews, the people of Israel, who had been driven from the Holy Land in ancient times, to return. In fact, a few years after this vision of Moses in the Kirtland Temple, the saints sent a member of their Council of 12 Apostles, a man named Orson Hyde, on a mission to Jerusalem, which was then part of the Turkish Empire. There Hyde stood on top of the Mount of Olives and prayed that one day Jews would be able to return to their historic homeland. This is one way in which the saints understood that they were contributing to the gathering of Israel, as Joseph and Oliver's vision of Moses in the Kirtland Temple had commissioned them to do. But the gathering of Israel had another meaning for the early saints as well, one that is perhaps more important for us today. The saints believed that through baptism, they themselves had become part of the people of Israel, God's people. At the same time that the saints anticipated a future gathering of Jews in the land of Palestine, they believed that God was calling them to build a second Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem, on what was then the American frontier in Independence, Missouri. This new Jerusalem, which the saints also called Zion, would be a community of people who were one in heart and mind, who shared everything they had with one another so that there would be no poor among them, and who raised a banner of peace to a world in conflict. The saints' effort to build this community in the 1830s failed. That's a whole other story, but it is to honor those first saints' Zion-building vision the Community of Christ today has its headquarters in Independence, Missouri. Words of counsel in Doctrine and Covenants called the early saints to gather to build this new Jerusalem in Independence. One section of Doctrine and Covenants instructed the saints to gather themselves from the eastern United States and move west, to gather or collect their wealth so that they could purchase land for the new Jerusalem. The words of counsel and vision would be a land of peace, a place to which people from every nation under heaven would be gathered together. That early vision of creating a community that consists of people brought together from every nation remains part of God's call to Community of Christ today. Recently, Doctrine and Covenants 163 has counseled us that we are called to become a sanctuary of Christ's peace, where people from all nations, ethnicities, and life circumstances can be gathered, that magic word, into a spiritual home without dividing walls. I see this image of a gathered community in Doctrine and Covenants 161 as well, where we are told, "Feel the yearnings of your brothers and sisters who are lonely, despised, fearful, neglected, unloved. Reach out in understanding, clasp their hands, and invite all to share in the blessings of community, created in the name of the one who suffered on behalf of all." Joseph and Oliver's vision of Moses in the Kirtland Temple reminds us that we are called to a ministry of gathering, or in other words, a ministry of invitation. As we say in the mission initiatives, we are called to invite people to Christ, to invite people who are lonely, despised, fearful, neglected, or unloved to come find a home in the community we have created in the name of Christ, whatever their nation, ethnicity, or life circumstances. After their vision of Moses, Joseph and Oliver had a vision of the prophet Elijah. They wrote, "Elijah the prophet, who was taken to heaven without tasting death, stood before us and said, 'The time has fully come, which was spoken of by the mouth of Malachi, testifying that he should be sent before the great and dreadful day of the Lord come, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers.'" What's this about? This is a reference to the last verses in the book of Malachi, which is the very end of the Old Testament. The prophet Malachi says that before the great day of God's judgment comes, Elijah the prophet, who is taken up into heaven, will return in order to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. Jews and early Christians understood this to mean that Elijah would come before the Messiah comes. To this day, when Jews celebrate Passover, they open the door of their home as a way of symbolically inviting Elijah to come, thus in turn symbolizing their continuing hope that the Messiah will come. There is hundreds of years' worth of commentary on what it means that Elijah will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Joseph Smith Jr. himself, in the years following his vision in the Kirtland Temple, reflected and preached on this passage. There are various meanings we could unpack from it, but at the most basic level, we're being told that there are people who have turned their hearts away from one another. They have become separated, alienated. The coming of Elijah, and therefore by extension, the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Christ, is a process of overcoming that separation and alienation, of bringing people's hearts back together. We find a similar message in Doctrine and Covenants 163, which warns us that there are subtle yet powerful influences in the world, some even claiming to represent Christ, that seek to divide people and nations, to accomplish their destructive aims. That which seeks to harden one human heart against another by constructing walls of fear and prejudice is not of God. Doctrine and Covenants 161 calls us to be part of the process of bringing together those whose hearts have been divided from one another. Become a people of the temple, those who see violence but proclaim peace, who feel conflict yet extend the hand of reconciliation. In Joseph and Oliver's vision of Elijah, who turns people's hearts back toward one another, I see a reminder that our faith community is called to a ministry of reconciliation, or in other words, a ministry of peacemaking. As we say in the mission initiatives, we are called to pursue peace on earth. Where does this leave us? 180 years ago, members of the religious group that gave rise to Community of Christ had a vision in the Kirtland Temple that reenacted Peter, James, and John's vision of the Transfiguration. I propose that their vision of Moses reminds us that our faith community is called to a ministry of gathering or invitation. I propose that their vision of Elijah reminds us that we are called to a ministry of reconciliation or peacemaking. Finally, I'd like to propose that their vision of Jesus reminds us of the third core mission initiative: abolish poverty and suffering. Jesus came into the world to share our human suffering, as he hopes that we too will share one another's suffering. More specifically, Jesus shared the life of the poor, as he hopes that we will identify with the poor and work for their needs. During his ministry, Jesus fed people who were hungry and healed people who were sick, setting an example of the work he wants us, his followers, to undertake. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus unleashed into creation divine powers capable of transforming creation, capable of transforming suffering, sorrow, grief, despair, and destruction into hope, joy, abundance, peace, and restoration. Those transforming powers are activated in the world through our ministry as Jesus' disciples. Joseph and Oliver's vision of the risen Jesus in the Kirtland Temple reminds me that we in Community of Christ are called, in the words of Doctrine and Covenants 165, to walk as Jesus did, the way of suffering love, to give up what we have or want for the benefit of others. I'd like to conclude by inviting you all to join me in a responsive reflection, inspired by the story of the Transfiguration in the New Testament and the story of the Transfiguration vision in the Kirtland Temple. This responsive reflection has two refrains. One of them is a response to God's call in the Gospel of Mark, "This is my Son, the Beloved, listen to him," to which our refrain will be, "Jesus, we are listening." The second refrain is taken from the words of Peter, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here," which we will recite as, "Teacher, it is good for us to be here." I will read, and I invite you to respond with me in the refrains. "A cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. 'This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him.' Jesus, we are listening." Become a sanctuary of Christ's peace, where people from all nations, ethnicities, and life circumstances can be gathered into a spiritual home. Jesus, we are listening. Feel the yearnings of your brothers and sisters who are lonely, despised, fearful, neglected, unloved. Invite all to share in the blessings of community. Jesus, we are listening. That which seeks to harden one human heart against another by constructing walls of fear and prejudice is not of God. Jesus, we are listening. Become a people who see violence but proclaim peace, who feel conflict yet extend the hand of reconciliation. Jesus, we are listening. Always remember, the way of suffering love that leads to the cross also leads to resurrection. Jesus, we are listening. I am he who was slain. I am he who lives. Teacher, it is good for us to be here. I will manifest myself to my people in mercy. I will speak to my servants. Teacher, it is good for us to be here. Thousands and tens of thousands will rejoice in consequence of the blessings that will be poured out on my people. Teacher, it is good for us to be here. Jesus, like your first disciples in ancient times, and like the early members of our particular faith community, we have committed to follow you. Your mission is our mission. Teacher, we are listening. Amen.